Well, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. It's good to be with you. I'm Leslie Manning. I'm a member of the Durham, Maine monthly meeting. I have to clarify that because some people confuse us with North Carolina or New Hampshire or England, Maine, and part of New England yearly meeting. And I convened the Israel-Palestine resource group that's under the care of New England yearly meeting. And we were formed as a result of several significant minutes in New England, committing ourselves to learning as much as we can about the situation in Palestine and Israel. And as Max will explain later, there's a strong historical connection between New England and Palestine, but also the connection is one of justice and fair treatment and dignity for all people. We're delighted to welcome Max to join us this evening. Part of what we hope to do is to bring the region more into our minds and hearts by listening to people who have spent time there, who know the region well, who know the people well, and can bring the life of that troubled area into the room with us. And no one, in my experience, can do that better than Max. Max is a retired educator, although he never stops teaching, and has an over 40-year connection with the people of Palestine and Israel, as he will explain. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that he will welcome questions, and I'm going to ask you to either put them in the chat or raise your hand electronically. That is to say, if you go down to the reactions setting on your computer, you will see a raise hand feature. It looks like that. It's currently in the upper corner of my screen. And I will do my best to recognize you. You can always shout out if you need to, but we'd prefer that you either put your questions into the chat or raise your hand in order to ask a question. Let's take a couple of minutes together to center together in the silence and invite Max to speak out of that silence. Welcome all.
Well, thank you, France. Thank you, Leslie, for that introduction. And I don't know how long moments of silence go in New England. Hope I didn't cut it off too quickly. Here at Guilford College, we have a tradition of having a moment of silence before the playing of the national anthem at athletic events. And the announcer says, in the tradition of the Society of Friends, we will have a moment of silence. It's usually 5 seconds. So anyway, wonderful to be with you. I know we don't have a lot of time to cover a lot of history and a lot of current events. So I want to lay out kind of an overview of what I want to touch on. And I do want this to be a conversation. So I'm glad that you have the opportunity to raise your hand or put questions in the chat, because I do want this to be a conversation. And I do want you to ask the questions that really matter to you. I'm an old professor, so I have a tendency to blather on about what interests me, but I want this to be an evening where you get your questions answered, or at least asked. So what I hope to do in terms of an outline is start off with just a very brief history of your own New England connections with Quaker work in Palestine. Then take a look at what Ramallah and the Quaker schools have experienced and have witnessed over the last 154 years of Quaker experience there. Then I'll share a bit about my own experience as a Vietnam era conscientious objector doing alternative service, teaching in the schools, and then our trips, our service learning trips that go there annually when there isn't a worldwide pandemic. We've done about 36 of those. And then we want to get to the current realities, what's happening now on the ground. And that just a couple hours ago offered us more to chew on as I read about further violence in the northern West Bank. And then all along, I hope you'll have questions, and certainly at the end, we'll try to leave time for wrapping things up with other questions that this presentation has risen. So what's the history of New England Yearly Meeting and Palestine and the Quaker work there? Well, it goes back to the late 1860s, and Eli and Sybil Jones, Rufus Jones's aunt and uncle from up there in China Lake, they were in Jerusalem attending an international Christian educators conference when they wandered the 9 miles from Jerusalem up to a dusty little village called Ramallah. The name is from the Aramaic and later Muslim incursion there. Ram is Aramaic for a hill, and Allah, of course, the Muslim name for God. So Ram Allah or Ram Allah is the hill of God, and it is hilly. It's in the central highlands of Palestine, about 2,400 feet above sea level. And wandering up there to this Christian village that was established in the 1500s by Christian families that came over from Transjordan, they were approached by a 14-year-old girl named Miriam Karam, who had had a bit of education at a convent school and wanted more. So recognizing Eli and Sybil as not local, said, would you start a school for girls? Well, ask a Quaker to start a school and step aside. They went back through England, back to New England, raised funds, and in 1869, this is miraculous, Quakers moved quickly, established a training school for girls under the Ottoman Turks. Now that itself is remarkable because girls were not offered education at the time. And Eli and Sybil, when they said, well, we'll look into it and did raise the money, actually asked, well, who will teach this school? And the little 14-year-old Miriam Karam said, I will. And she was the first teacher. Now, that school then eventually spread to about 35 villages where these training institutions for girls were established. And in 1888, coalesced into one school in Ramallah, still a girls' school, as a boarding school. So the boarding school began in 1888 after the schools were in the various villages as day schools. 1901, they established a boys' school. So again, remarkably, the boys' school came more than 30 years after the school for girls. The Hussies were one of the major players from North Berwick, Maine, Timothy and Anna Hussey. Many of you probably know the Hussey Seating Company there in North Berwick. That's the descendant of the old plow company. And in his retirement, Timothy and Anna spent years in Ramallah purchasing the land and supervising the construction of the girls' school buildings, the meeting house, and the boys' school buildings that still stands there, solid stone structures. And Timothy Hussey was there early March of 1910 for the dedication of the meeting house on his 79th birthday, and left for New England the day after, never to return. But Anna, who had passed away 3 years before, and her sister lie in the graveyard there in Ramallah. So if any of you ever make pilgrimage or go on one of our service learning trips to Ramallah, you have to go and visit those folk. Interestingly enough, those of you who are familiar with Quaker Hill, Friends United meetings offices in Richmond, Indiana, one of the buildings at Quaker Hill is the Quaker Hill Conference Center. Evans House, old Isaac Evans, a miller, married Anna Hussey's sister, and a portrait of her hangs there in one of the parlors at Quaker Hill. So that's your New England connection. It was really a mission outreach of New England Yearly Meeting. Back in the day, individual yearly meetings kind of took on an area for mission work. Iowa did Jamaica. Indiana did Mexico. Ohio did Kenya. And New England did Palestine. And eventually that was all coalesced into the Board of Missions of 5 years meeting, now Friends United meeting. Now, again, Ramallah was a small Christian village, just a few thousand people, very rural, peasants, everyone essentially farmed. But over the last 154 years, it has transformed tremendously. A lot has happened there in 154 years, especially 4 different occupations. The Quaker work began under the Ottoman Turks. That ended with World War I and the British Mandate. So the British occupation lasted from the end of World War I until they turned it over to the United Nations, and the area was partitioned in 1948. And then the war that created the modern state of Israel broke out. And Ramallah was then occupied by the Jordanians, whose forces came in as the Egyptians did in Gaza. And the school and Ramallah lived under Jordanian occupation then until 1967 and the Six-Day War, when the Israeli occupation began. And depending on which Palestinians you talk to, they are living under another occupation, actually a double occupation since 1993, and the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority. We'll get into talking a bit about how most Palestinians think of the Palestinian National Authority now, and their government and their security arrangements with Israel and all of that mess. But essentially, there have been 4, or you could say 5, different occupations of Ramallah just in the last 154 years. And in fact, if you talk to most Palestinians, they will talk about the long hope they have of eventually gaining independence and freedom, saying, you know, we've been occupied since Canaanite times. So this is another occupation. This is another empire. We're here. You know, where are the other empires? We'll watch this one leave too. That's part of the attitude of folk there. So that's a reality. Constant occupation, desire for independence, but always frustrated. Now, my experience in getting to Palestine relates to my good fortune of having the foresight to be born in a county in Indiana chock full of Amish, Quakers, Mennonites, and Brethren. So when the draft came for me when I was 18, and I went to my draft board and applied for conscience objector status, they just said, oh, just go away and do something for 2 years. I didn't have the same problem many people did who were less fortunate in choosing the county to be raised in. Everything, as you may recall, depended on your draft board. And some draft boards were more lenient than others. Mine was used to conscious objectors, so I had not only a conscious objector status granted, I had 4 years of student deferment while I was in college, 66 to 70, to decide where I wanted to do my alternative service, because I knew I'd be volunteering. I wanted to do my 2 years of service, no matter what my lottery number was going to be. And I had grown up hearing about my great aunt Annis Carter's time in Ramallah. Between 1929 and 1967, she spent 14 years in Quaker missionary work, mostly in Ramallah, as a teacher and principal of the Friends Girls' School. So I was familiar with it, the name, had no clue about the culture, language, politics, and stuff. So when I went over in 1970 to teach math and English at the Friends Boys' School, fresh off the dairy farm in Indiana, it was drinking water out of a fire hose. My first month, just to lay out what this naive farm boy from Indiana experienced, the first week of school, the PFDLP and the PLO, two Palestinian guerrilla organizations in 1970, hijacked 4 airplanes, flew 3 of them into Jordan, 1 of them into Egypt, eventually got all the passengers off and blew them up. Some of you may remember having seen that on TV or in pictures. And my first revelation as a naive Quaker peacenik was 3 of my students coming to the playground and asking, Mr. Carter, what do you think about the plane hijackings? And I said, well, of course, I gave the standard Quaker answer. I don't approve of violence. I don't want anyone hurt. And these boys said, we really don't want to use violence either. We don't want to see anyone hurt. But the world pays attention to violence. That's what gets people's attention. And just last week, the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, in response to a question, what are you going to do about the Palestinian problem, said, what Palestinians? There are no Palestinians. How do we get the world's attention? They pay attention to violence. That was a revelation in terms of what motivates some of these actions. My second week, the Jordanian Civil War broke out, Black September. We could see the smoke 40 miles away in Amman, but had no idea what was going on because there wasn't really much communication. And that was when the PLO was driven out of Jordan by King Hussein and his forces. It was very nearly a major conflict, as local folks said, if the Marines ever land in Jordan in support of Hussein, American interests will be eliminated. And the Quaker schools were an American interest run by Friends United Meeting. So that got our attention a bit. And that was my first understanding of what the hopes and dreams of my students were. They had seen the PLO as that movement that would liberate historic Palestine. And when it was crushed by Hussein, it was a devastating blow to those hopes and dreams. The third week, Jamal Abdel Nasser died, the president of Egypt, who was another great hope of Palestinians. He was the unifying force for the Arab nations, and they saw him as their defender on the world stage. So that was my first month in Ramallah, and been learning ever since. Now, after my 2 years were up there, continued to return with Friends United Meeting work camps, service learning trips, academic trips through Guilford College and other independent travel and study there, probably about 36 different trips since I left in 72. And this summer's trip will be June 6th through 24. If anyone's interested, I'll say a bit more about the focus of that trip later on. So what are the current realities there? Well, first of all, the schools are thriving. They are now coeducational, pre-K through 12, with more than 1,400 students. Coeducational all the way through, international baccalaureate all the way through, and usually about 100 graduates each year, all of whom go off to the finest colleges and universities around the world. About a quarter stay there at local universities, Birzeit, Bethlehem, University of Bethlehem, Najah, universities in Hebron and Nablus, mostly Birzeit. Another quarter go to Europe or England, where education is either free or cheaper, or can be done in only 3 years. About half go to the United States, and you see a lot of them there in New England. The top ones wind up at Harvard, MIT, the Ivies. They come out of the Friends schools with an amazing education. They're the best schools in Palestine, certainly, and among the best in the Middle East. So you can be rightfully proud of what you New England Quakers hath wrought in education there. But they are constantly under financial constraints because of the economic situation. Now, those who can afford the $5,000 to $6,000 a year in tuition, and I know Americans find that laughable, that that's expensive, because you go to Westtown or George School or any of those fine Quaker schools around Philadelphia. I don't know what Cambridge Friends School is like, but you're talking $40,000 to $50,000. But $5,500 to $6,000 in Palestine is a good chunk of change in an economic situation they live in, which means that most of the families who can afford to send their students there are middle to upper class. And many of those are involved with the government, very business people, doctors, lawyers, and are doing quite well. Now, they have scholarships. They try to get students who are not as well off, those everyone's got refugee status. So to have refugees there doesn't really mean much. To get them out of the camps, though, is very difficult, both financially and because the education they have had in the UNRWA schools, the United Nations schools, makes it very difficult for them to compete, so to speak, with the curriculum of the Friends school. So that's an issue, the finances and the demographics. But they're thriving. Everyone wants to go to the Friends school. They've got a long waiting list, and they keep adding seats in classrooms, both financially and because there's such a demand. Now, of course, in the background is the occupation. Although Ramallah is, I don't know if, let me give a really quick Oslo Peace Accords description of how the West Bank, how the occupied Palestinian territories are divided up. According to the Oslo peace agreements in the early 90s, the occupied territories were divided up into areas A, B, and C. Area A is under the complete control, supposedly, of the Palestinian National Authority. That's 12% of the occupied Palestinian territories. They are the major urban centers. And the PA has full control, supposedly, of those areas: Bethlehem, Nablus, Hebron, Ramallah. Area B, which is 20% or so of the occupied territories, are the villages, the small villages. And Palestinians have basic control over health, human services, education, garbage pickup, but cooperate with Israel on security. So in other words, Israel controls them. The rest of the occupied territory, 60%, with the exclusion of Gaza, the disengagement in 2005 left Gaza, Israeli troops left and dismantled the settlements there. So we're leaving Gaza off the moment. But 61% of the occupied territories, the more open land, very small villages, is Area C, under the total control of Israel. And that's where the settlements are going in. And the settlements surround all the major population centers. From the center of Ramallah, you look around and there's a settlement on each hilltop. So although you have total control of Ramallah, you can't get out without Israel's permission. You have to apply for travel permits to get out of this canton that might be 7 miles across, maybe. You're 9 miles away from Jerusalem. You can't go to Jerusalem unless you get permission from Israel. And you have to go through at least one checkpoint to get there. So Ramallah, if you're in Ramallah, it looks great. It's a world-class city. You walk down the main street and you'd think you're on Rodeo Drive or Regent Street or the Champs-Élysées with the high-class hotels, shops, and all of that. But as our friends there say, it's the 5-star occupation. They're still occupied. It still constrains the economy and makes it very, very crowded because you can't build outside of Area A, so you build up. So a small little dusty village that Eli and Sybil Jones met was first then swelled by the refugee population after the 48 war, as refugees flooded into Ramallah from the plains and the coastal cities. The meeting house that Timothy Hussey helped construct seats about 100 people. It's a small building. There were 9 families who lived there for 2 years as refugees after 48. And the whole town swelled in population. The demographics changed from a Christian village to a mixed village and now a majority Muslim village, or now a city with about 300,000 people in it. So major changes there, but everything, every aspect of life is dictated by the military occupation. What you can, even the curriculum at the Friends schools is looked at by Israel, even though they have no control over it. They like to critique the textbooks. It's kind of like Florida, where some external authority is looking to see what can you teach and what can you include and all of that. So every aspect of your life, even in Ramallah, is touched by this occupation. Now, let me pause there for a moment to see if there are any questions about any of that all too brief overview of history and experience. And I see Steve Chase, who's going to go there this summer and see it for himself, is there.
Go ahead, Steve. And then Skip.
Yeah.
Thanks, Max. This is kind of a more historical question, is do you know of any evidence whether any wing of Quakers identified with Christian Zionism?
Not over there. Here,
yeah,
yes.
I would think not over there.
Well, there were many, I have to say that many Christians in Palestine kind of unknowingly get hooked up with Christian Zionist organizations, because Christian Zionist organizations go over to Palestine and offer field trips and amenities because Israel gives them opportunity to give travel permits. And so if you're locked in and you have this opportunity to get, wow, we can get tickets to go into Jerusalem for the holy days, you latch on. And only later do you find, oh, this is a Christian Zionist organization. So there's some of that going on. There's even one of those outposts in Ramallah that some of our friends have kind of gotten hooked into until they realized what they were doing. Now here in North Carolina, the Bible Belt, when I speak about the Palestinian-Israeli issue, there are many Quakers who will confront me with their understanding of the narrative. They won't use the term Christian Zionism, but it is the whole scenario. Well, God gave this land to the Jews. It's biblical that they must come back, and the temple has to be rebuilt, for Jesus to return. It's the whole scenario. They may not know it as Christian Zionism, but it's part of their people talked about the term Christian Zionism, return from Palestine and be confronted by the same thing in the 1950s and 60s, as she would defend the Palestinian narrative. And they would say, well, God gave the land to the Jews. And her response was always, as a Quaker Christian missionary, it came with conditions. And the conditions have not been met. Didn't always silence them, but she always had a comeback. Yeah. Skip's got his hand up too.
Max, could you give us an update on the young man? First name is Shadi, student at the
Right.
school, was dragged out from his home and treated very badly by the Israeli military. And more generally, the relationship between the Israeli authorities and students of the school.
Okay. Thank you for asking. I was going to get to Shadi. Shadi Khoury is a Christian student. His mother was a co-founder of Sabil, the Palestinian Liberation Theology Center, and lives in Beit Hanina, which is in occupied East Jerusalem, between Ramallah and the old city. For those not familiar, Shadi is an 11th grader, 16-year-old 11th grader at the Friends School. And in October, the middle of the night, Israeli forces, about 20, I understand, or more, broke in to their house in Beit Hanina, demanded that he undress, which he refused to do. So he was bloodied and hauled off and imprisoned. No charges. This is part of Israel's judicial understanding of administrative detention. They have the right legally to detain people for 6 months under suspicion, just for administrative detention without any charges. So he was in prison, in a pretty brutal prison, with many other children. There are hundreds of children as young as 12, 13, 14 in these prisons. And he was kept there without initially his parents getting to see him or lawyers getting to see him. Eventually, they were able to see him, but they kept delaying any court appearances. So he was there for weeks before there was any real hearing, but still no charges. What they were trying to do was to get people to snitch on others. 12 or 13-year-old kids, are going to miss their families, going to miss home, and might say about anything if they're promised to be let off the hook. So it was an attempt to create conditions for kids to blow the whistle on each other. There was suspicion of rock throwing, things like that. And still no charges. Eventually, the court, Israeli court, granted him release from prison under house arrest. So he could go home. I think this happened in December. He could go home, but he couldn't leave his house. And the school set up, thank goodness for Zoom and all of that, set him up with a Zoom classroom, but he could not leave the house. But still, no trial date. and no charges. Last week, there was another hearing, and the court ordered him released from house arrest to attend school in person, but only to go directly from the house to school, accompanied by his family or close relatives, probably parents, and go straight back home. The prosecution protested, and for a while, for a few days last week, it looked like that was not going to be allowed. The prosecution then withdrew that protest, and Shaddy is now allowed to go from home to school and directly back home. Still no trial date and still no charges. So it's still unacceptable. I imagine if the school does what I would do if I were in charge, we'll extend the school day through extracurricular activities well into the evening. So Shaddy has some semblance of a social life, and is not restricted to home. But that's Shaddy's experience. But it's the experience of hundreds, if not thousands, of children. AFSC has a No Way to Treat a Child campaign to address this. And Shaddy's one of the lucky ones, because well-educated, for a well-educated family, can afford a lawyer, and international attention brought to this. I just imagine the hundreds of kids that don't have access to that. Other questions before I?
There's a question in the chat, Max, from Erica, who asks, who supports Palestine?
Well, it depends on what you mean. Now, financially, they get a lot of aid from the European Union. If you wander through Ramallah or Nablus, Hebron, some of the big cities, and even the small villages, you will see signs from Germany, Italy, France, England, as sponsors of rehabilitation of buildings, of sewage works, of water works, of roadways. And so a lot of that aid, the United States gives some aid through U.S. aid and ASHA. The schools have benefited millions of dollars through American Schools and Hospitals Abroad, a program of U.S. aid. And United States gives, well, again, it sounds like a lot of money to some folk, about 150 million a year into Palestine, essentially to beef up the security apparatus, on condition that the security apparatus of Palestine protects Israel. The security apparatus in Palestinian Authority doesn't protect Palestinians. And we've seen this happen about every night at 3 or 3:30. Israeli troops come in the Area A as well, come into Ramallah, and the commander of the unit phones up the security director in Ramallah and says, "We're coming in. Get your men off the streets." And they do. They comply. In comes armored personnel vehicles, the jeeps. They blow up a house or two, arrest a few people, and head back out. 3 at 3:30 almost every night. And security gets off the streets. And that's part of the agreement from the Oslo Accords and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority. And so a lot of our aid goes there. Now, that 150 million is compared to the 3.8 billion we give Israel each year, mostly in military hardware as well. That's part of the Camp David Accords. But they do get financial aid from the European Union especially, and from the Gulf states and the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. The unemployment rate is high. UNRWA takes care of a lot of the folk in refugee camps who are unemployed on a small dole and education, health, things like that, human services. But in terms of politically, it's hard to see where they are benefiting from those who are sympathetic with their plight, because the United States has veto power in the Security Council. And just this last week, there was a Security Council resolution about the settlements. And the current government in Israel is expanding the settlements. They approved another 7,000 housing units. And the United States blocked the latest condemnation of that in a less virulent way than when Nikki Haley was our ambassador, but still, they did a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, said, well, we really would rather you not. Could you delay it for a while? He said, okay, we'll delay it for 6 months. And that's the only concession we got out of it. But Israel has guarantees, essentially, that the United States will block anything in the Security Council that will be disadvantageous to their occupation. But one of the things that's interesting is there's growing support for Palestine among young Jewish people around the world. And there's several very interesting groups that have emerged recently: Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, Code Pink, that are very, very supportive of Palestinian issues and opposed to the occupation. By some estimates, I've read upwards of 40% of young American Jews are not supporting Israel as an occupier, and that has concerned. I know the local rabbis that I've talked with here in Greensboro are quite concerned that their own children are not where they are or where their grandparents were in their support of Israel. So that's an interesting development. And one of the groups that we work with, and again, Steve will get a chance to meet these people this summer on the trip, is Israelis who served in the military, who formed an organization called Breaking the Silence, Shovrim Shtika in Hebrew. And these were soldiers who got in the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, for all the reasons that patriotic people do, to protect their families, to protect the homeland. And in their 3 years, if you're men, 2.5 if you're a woman, obligatory service in the military, if they were in the occupied territories, realized, well, many of them, this is not providing security. This is control. And even the checkpoints and the wall are not providing security. They are a means of control of people. And it's not for the benefit long-term of my homeland. It's breeding anger, hatred, it's breeding terrorism, if you want to use that term. And so many hundred, probably about 1,000 of these folks formed the organization Breaking the Silence to publicize what's really going on in the occupied territories and take Israelis, large part, on tour of the occupied territories, the Area C, where they can go to show them. And this is one of the things we do. We go into Hebron, into what's called H2. Hebron is a divided city. About 220,000 Palestinians live in 80% of Hebron, and about 350 to maybe 700, 800 radical settlers occupy 20% of the city in what's called H2. And the Breaking the Silence soldiers take us up Shahada Street, which was renovated in the late 1990s by American money, USAID money. Beautiful infrastructure, roads, drainage systems, repairing the old market area. It was gorgeous. And then these radical settlers took over, especially after the Baruch Goldstein massacre in 1994, when the area was divided for security reasons. And now the job of the Israeli soldiers is to keep Shahada Street sterile, this is their term, sterile of Palestinians. Palestinians not allowed on the street. There are 5 Palestinian families that still own property and live on Shuhada Street. Their front doors are welded shut. They're not allowed to go out their front doors. They have to go through holes in the roof, skip over rooftops to get into the area of Hebron where they can shop. And these soldiers show us this and explain that their job as soldiers was to protect the settlers, not the Palestinians, as the settlers closed down 1,200 Arab shops in that area. And they show it to us as a microcosm of the occupation. So if you can understand Hebron, you can understand the occupation and why this does not work, why this is not sustainable. It's a fascinating time. So there are those groups also, even in Israel. B'Tselem, the human rights organization, Shovrim Shtika, Parent Circle, Combatants for Peace, Zakat. There are quite a few small groups, but the Second Intifada pretty much laid waste to the left in Israel. And we've seen increasingly radical far-right governments in Israel. They now have the most far-right government in Israel's history, and that's saying something. And they have every intention of annexing Area C, at least in the West Bank. We have a friend of ours who's now the prime minister, Mohammed Shtaya, who before he became prime minister met with us each year on our service learning trips to talk about the situation. He was a minister of labor in the cabinet with the PA, and he was also one of the chief negotiators in the peace talks. He was Saeb Erekat kind of right-hand person in the peace talk, in the negotiations. And he told us the last time we talked with him that before he went into the last round of negotiations, which, were stopped 3 or 4 years ago because they were not doing anything, he met with Tzipi Livni, who was a candidate for prime minister in the last couple of elections, who was his negotiating partner. And before they went into the negotiating room, where at the time Netanyahu said no preconditions before the negotiations. And Tzipi Livni said, oh, by the way, the Jordan Valley is off the table. That's ours. Well, the Jordan Valley is 30% of the West Bank. So they've already essentially annexed 30% of the West Bank. And the current government has every intention, if they can get by with it, of annexing at least Area C, where the settlements are. So that's part of the current situation. I see there was another question about the missiles.
Yes, Erica asks, which Palestinians are responsible for missiles aimed at Tel Aviv, and who, I assume the word is, funds them?
Yeah, those come from Gaza, which is controlled by Hamas. And Islamic Jihad is there as well, Muslim Brotherhood connected with those organizations, and largely funded by Iran, and certainly connections with Hezbollah. Now, the rockets are getting more and more sophisticated as some of the rocketry is smuggled in. Most of them are inefficient, ineffective, homemade kind of pipe bombs. One of the places we visit on our service learning trips is a kibbutz up on the Lebanon-Syria border. And Lior Shelef, who takes us on a tour of their bomb shelters and all of that, because they're right there next to the Golan Heights and where Hezbollah has emplacements on Mount Hermon. He actually says, we don't really worry too much about a few peasants on donkey back with homemade rockets over their shoulders. Said, we've got an app on our phones for that. We know when their rockets are going to come, and an app on their phone alerts them, and they head back to their houses. They don't even go to the bomb shelters anymore because their houses, by Israeli law, are built so that a rocket could fall on the house and would not do any damage. So they get the app, rockets will be coming, they go to their houses or bomb shelters. Now that's up on the Lebanon-Syria border. Now the Sderot and Israeli towns near Gaza, they've got the same thing. They've got apps. They don't have the same professional soldiers firing rockets like they do from Lebanon, Hezbollah. Lior will tell us, we know when the rockets will come. It's 10, 2, 4. They take breaks. They have tea time. So we know it's not quite the same in Gaza. Sometimes these are just lone wolf operations or retaliation for killing 11 people in Nablus, and some rockets will fly over. But again, there's technology that alerts the folks to when the rockets are coming, and most of them are ineffective. And those that do come over are typically intercepted by the Iron Dome defense system that the United States has given Israel. Now, there are some rockets that have begun to have longer range and reach the outskirts of Tel Aviv, the outskirts of Jerusalem. That's where they're coming from. None are coming from inside the West Bank. Are there other questions before we move to the next thing?
One other question, again from Erica, is two-state solution, ?
Okay. That is still the official policy of the United States, two-state solution. Anthony Blinken, again, gave lip service to it the last time he was over there a week or two ago. It's still the official position of the Palestinian National Authority, because if it isn't, they don't get aid from the United States. I mean, it's part of that. Nobody believes in it. Not a Palestinian that we talk to, even those in the PA, say that it's realistic. They say it's dead for several reasons. One, if you take a look at the placement of these settlements, 750,000 settlers in the occupied West Bank, in settlements that, if you hear settlement, quite often people think of kind of a Wild West village, some wind-blown house trailers on a dusty hilltop. They're towns of 55 and 60,000 people. They have industry, they have schools, parks, infrastructure. These are cities, and they're not going anywhere. And they're 130 to 170, close to 200 settlements throughout the West Bank, strategically located around Jerusalem to essentially annex Jerusalem and its suburbs, so that will always be Israel's. And the Clinton parameters essentially guaranteed that. And then on the hilltops around the major cities, Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, settlements all around. They're all connected by their own road system, modern highways that, in most cases, only those with Israeli citizenship or settlers can drive on. And you can tell because they have yellow license plates. Those with white or green license plates are Palestinians. They have their own road system. And in many cases, they go under the Israeli road system in tunnels. It's like a separate reality has been laid down on top of the Palestinian reality, and never the twain shall meet. Now, when you take a look at where these settlements are and the infrastructure that connects them, you realize they're permanent. And Israel is moving to annex them. And that's why the security barrier or the fence, the wall, whatever you want to call it, doesn't follow the green line. If you look at the occupied West Bank and the green line, which is the armistice line from the 1948-49 war, the wall fence does not follow the green line, which would make sense if it's a security. Well, the Palestinians are on the other side of the armistice line. Israel's on this side of it. Let's build a fence there. No, it goes deep inside the West Bank to surround these settlements, annexing about 12% more of the West Bank. So when you see that matrix of control, which creates a discombobulated Palestinian reality, these areas A, the major villages and cities of Palestinian population, are disconnected. You know, to get from one place to the other, you have to get Israel's permission because you have to go through Area C. So a contiguous, autonomous Palestinian state isn't possible. And in fact, Netanyahu has said, no, we control everything from the river to the sea. We will always control everything from the river to the sea. You can't have a state, a modern independent state like that. So if there's no two-state solution possible, what are the alternatives? Well, maintain the status quo, because Israel has the power. They're a nuclear force. They have about 200 nuclear warheads. They've got the third or fourth largest military in the world, certainly the largest military in the region. They can maintain control by force for a long time. But it's not sustainable in the long haul as the demographic shifts. Non-Jews are now probably the majority population from the river to the sea, if you include Gaza, the non-Jewish citizens of Israel, and the population of the West Bank. So you can control people by force for only so long when you're the minority. We saw that in South Africa. This is why BDS is such a scary proposition for Israel. They've seen how boycott, divestment, sanctions worked in South Africa. So if the status quo doesn't work in the long haul and is only maintained by violence, and recently we've seen what that means. Israel's killed more than 60 Palestinians already in just the first 2 months of this year, and way more than 100 last year in these raids into the West Bank. And that just creates more violence, and this retaliation follows retaliation, and people get angrier and angrier. That's not sustainable in the long haul. So what people are talking about now, some in Israel, peace activists, and most Palestinians, is a one-state solution. Now, of course, worldwide Jewry and Israel don't accept that, because one state rule, when you're a minority, means you can't be a Jewish state if you're going to be a democracy. So what do you do if you can't maintain the status quo over the long haul? Two-state solution isn't possible. And a one state where you have freedom and democratic rights for all citizens of this one state is unacceptable for those who want a Jewish homeland. Well, what some Israeli and Palestinian philosophers, thinkers, academics are proposing now, just to get it on the table for people to think, is a one homeland, two nations proposal, that you can live anywhere in historic Palestine, British Mandate Palestine, and be a citizen either of Israel or of a Palestinian state. So you can be a settler in the West Bank, and you're a citizen of Israel, governed by Israeli law, courts, and all that. You can be a Palestinian living in Israel or the West Bank, and you're a citizen of a Palestinian state with their laws and regulations, serving their military if they have a military. It's a pipe dream. It sounds like it would be difficult to implement, but Switzerland's managed to do it, kind of. And so this is one of the things that's on the table as kind of an academic exercise. Let's think outside the box and think of one homeland in two nations as people live wherever they want in historic Palestine, but are citizens of an Israeli, a Jewish state, or a Palestinian state. Yeah. Steve, again?
Yeah, I just finished your book, Palestine and Israel, A Personal Encounter, and I was really interested in the chapter when you were part of the International Quaker Working Group that published a book
When
through the AFSC. And one of the things you said that I found really interesting is when you were debriefing with the group, that you all felt like you couldn't say what you really believed would be the most just solution. And you intimated in the book that group, after its tour and discussion, actually felt that the one-state solution would be the most just. But I would just like to hear more of the reflections of that group and how your thinking may have changed since then.
Yeah. Well, at the time, this was 2002, a two-state solution seemed more viable. This was fresh on the heels of the failed Camp David Accords on the last days of Clinton, but at Taba, the Palestinians accepted proposals that the Israelis reject, because Barak had to hurry back because he was in a fight for his political life. He lost that election. Sharon comes to power and is pretty much dead. But there was still that hope that given the Palestinians said, okay, the Palestinians in 1988 recognized Israel and said, we recognize Israel in 78% of historic Palestine. Give us the remaining 22% with a capital in East Jerusalem, and we can live with that. And then the agreements that were made by Arafat at Taba after the Camp David Accords failed gave us the hope that might be possible. Well, when we talked with most Palestinians, they were very skeptical that one of the reasons that Arafat initially rejected the proposals at Camp David was that he knew he couldn't get a plebiscite to approve that Palestinians still held on to the hope of return to their homes. They still held those keys. They still had, that dream of a restored Palestine. Now, since then, we've moved the embassy to Jerusalem. Israel's declared this is our eternal capital, all of Jerusalem, and all of Jerusalem now encompasses everything from the old city up to the outskirts of Ramallah and south to the outskirts of Bethlehem and all the settlement blocks around it. And Ma'ali Adumim, this Israeli settlement of probably now 70,000 people, stretches from Jerusalem almost down to the Jordan Valley, cutting the West Bank in half. Then you have all these settlements and the infrastructure connecting them all, which are more effective in dividing up the country than the walls. You can't get across a 4-lane highway with electric fence and free fire zones and all this kind of stuff. So if you look at the facts on the ground, the realities, there's just no possibility of a two-state solution. And yeah.
Yesterday when I called.
Any Other questions like that? Okay. Well, let me give you a few quick vignettes just to give some sense of the possibilities and the challenge. I've already talked about breaking the silence and the young Israelis, veterans of the war and of the occupation and of military service who are opposed to the occupation. And they don't have a political solution to it. They just say we have to end the occupation. Then we can figure out whether it's one state, two state, one homeland, two nations, but we've got to stop the occupation. Now, those voices are being drowned out more and more by this radical far-right government of Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, and some who literally want to force the Palestinians out. They know they can't pile them into boxcars and backs of trucks and ship them out in the modern world, but they can make the conditions so bad that people voluntarily leave, called voluntary transfer. So that's a real thing. But there are these glimmers of hope, and one is, although it's only a very, very small glimmer, if Israelis can actually come to understand the reality of the Palestinian situation, there is a possibility that some of the blinders might come off. And the reason I say that is an experience we had with a settler by the name of Teddy Weinberger, who we would meet in Jerusalem with our groups to get the settler perspective. He's a PhD in American religious history. He used to teach at Florida State, then migrated to Israel about 25 years ago and used to live in one of the settlements. And then I think his conscience got to him, and he moved out of that settlement back into Israel proper and out of the occupied West Bank. But while he lived in Givat Se'ev, which is just outside of Jerusalem, we would meet with him to get his settler perspective. And I kept saying, you need to go into Ramallah with us sometimes. Oh, no, I couldn't do that. It's too dangerous. I could never go into Ramallah. Well, we finally convinced him a few years ago to go into Ramallah one Sunday. And he was still so nervous that he insisted I come in to a hotel in Jerusalem and accompany him back out to Ramallah on the Arab bus. And as we were driving to Ramallah, just to make conversation, I was pointing out to him how we tell our groups. You can tell the Jewish homes from the Arab homes. Arab homes have big water tanks on top because they only get water a couple of times a week, maybe only once a week if you're in the small villages. And water is turned on, you store it up in these tanks, and gravity feeds into your home. And he said, that can't be true. He said, we get water piped right into our homes here in the West Bank. I said, well, no, as I point out all these water tanks on the Palestinian homes. He said, well, that can't be true of hotels and hospitals. Certainly not. As I point out, hotels and hospitals with water tanks on top of them. He said, at the end of the day, after he had witnessed this, he told me as I accompanied him back into Jerusalem, I've lived in this settlement for 20 years. I can see a Palestinian village from my front porch. I didn't know this. I didn't know the situation about water. And then he marveled at the fact he was meeting Palestinians. He had never met a Palestinian. 20 years living in this settlement. In sight of Palestinian village, he'd never met a Palestinian. And the day in Ramallah just blew his mind for that reason. He wandered around safely among Palestinians. He didn't understand the water situation. And when I told him one of the first things we were going to do was go to Quaker worship, this PhD in religion said, there are Christians in Ramallah? So, well, where do you think Christianity started? Not in Ramallah, but certainly here. He didn't know that there were Christians in Ramallah. They said, well, then certainly the Christians and Palestinians can't, I mean, Muslims can't get along well. They must be at each other's throats. They, no, as he witnesses throughout the day, the cooperation of Muslims and Christians. And at the end of the day, this just blew his mind. And he said, I'm going to struggle with this. I'm going to have to process this for quite some time. But he said, as he left me, but at the end of the day, we're at war with people who want to kill us. But that seed was planted. And I know in some further conversations with him, these stereotypes were destroyed in large part. And it's not the solution for the whole thing, because simply getting people together, getting Israelis and Palestinians together to meet each other, have coffee, learn that we're all humans, that doesn't end in addressing the occupation, the denial of Palestinians their human rights. It's what they call normalization. It makes things appear to be normal, appear to be fine and hunky-dory, but doesn't address the root cause of the violence and the occupation and the inequalities. But it's a first step. And I think if we can dance around the whole normalization issue and find a way to debunk these myths and stereotypes, we've got a chance. And one of the people who did that in a very creative way was a Jewish dermatologist from nearby Winston-Salem, who in his own experience, growing up Orthodox Jewish in Washington, D.C. as a child, heard the typical narrative. This was an empty desert before European Jews came and made the desert bloom. And he went to Israel for the first time after he married his wife, and they were over to visit some of her family members who lived in Jerusalem. And as a scientist, he kept hearing about these 750,000 refugees created by the 48 war. And the scientific mind in him said, now wait, if this was empty, where did 750,000 Palestinians come from? So then he started exploring himself into the history. And he read, some of the new historians, Benny Morris, Ari Shavit, Ilan Pape. I learned about Plan D, the massacre of Deir Yassin, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And it blew his mind. And he wound up writing a book called Compartments, about how even scientists and people who should know better live in these compartments. And when other facts conflict with the compartment that you live in, you've been trained in, you either get out of that compartment, get out of your silo, or you hunker down and defend your narrative, even when all the facts conflict with it. And he was one who got out of his compartment. And then he went on our trip with us a few years ago. And of course, his friends were saying, as a Jew, that's dangerous. You're going to be killed. You'll get into the West Bank, and before you know it, you're going to have a knife to your throat. And so one of the first things he asked us to do when he got into Ramallah was, I want to have a shave and a haircut. And he didn't look like he needed a shave and a haircut, but I said, okay. We got him to a local barber. And he told us later on why. When he went back to Winston-Salem and gave talks in synagogues and elsewhere, he would start off his talk by saying, before I went on this trip into the Palestinian territories, I was told that it was dangerous, that I'd probably have a knife to my throat. And they were right. And it was the best shave I ever got. I mean, those are, again, small little seeds, small little examples of what can happen when people have those compartments challenged. But right now, with a wall and a separate reality of Jewish life laid down on top of the Palestinian life. There's no interaction. There's no interaction. The only Palestinians Israelis see, probably just on the news, are terrorists. The only Israeli Jews most Palestinians see, especially children, are soldiers at checkpoints or on these raids. So it creates an image in the mind. But what Palestinians keep telling us is, we just want an end to the occupation. If we are given a life and our children, have a bright future ahead of them, I guarantee you that if the occupation ends and we're given our rights, then we'll be the first ones out in the streets stopping the violence, because we don't want, our freedom and our independence threatened. So anyway, that's a long way around the question. So that's one of the hopes we have. One other example of these possibilities is in Israel, in a village that we visit, and we'll do this again this summer, of Ibleen. It's what Palestinians in Israel who are citizens of Israel call themselves 1948 Arabs. They're often called Israeli Arabs, but they usually say, we are among those who remained in historic Palestine after Israel was created, and we are now Israeli citizens. They call themselves 1948 Arabs. And again, they're 25% of the population. And there are about 50 separate laws that discriminate against them, that disadvantage them in relationship to the minority, the majority population in Israel, including not being required to serve in the military, which is the way you advance in Israeli society. Palestinians don't have to serve in the military. There are certain programs you can't take in college, university, because they're seen as security risk. You can't get building permits. You can't buy land. 94% of the land is owned by the Jewish National Fund. So there, all that stuff happening. But in this village of Ibleen, there's a school called Mar Elias that was founded by Elias Shakur. He's a Melkite priest. Wonderful book about him is by autobiography, in fact, Blood Brothers. As a child, grew up in a little village in what became Israel, and watched his village bombed to smithereens, and they became homeless. But he went off, became a priest, and came back to this little village of Ibleen and established this school in the 1980s for Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Druze, to be a place where you're not born Jewish, you're not born Muslim, you're not born Druze, you're not born Christian, you're born babies. And you find out a way to live together. Since the Second Intifada, it's been difficult to find Jewish students, but they've had exchange programs, they've had Jewish faculty, but Elias Shakur continues to advocate for Palestinian rights, very critical of Israel, but is a model for coexistence and the work for equality. And another place that we visit that tries to model that is Wat al Salam, Neve Shalom, the Israeli peace community on the Green Line. We'll visit there again this summer as well. And they're Christians, Muslims, and Jews who are citizens of Israel, but are Palestinians and Jews, try to do the hard work of living together. And it's hard. It's hard to honor each other's culture, language. They have one of the few integrated schools in Israel. There are only a handful, literally, of integrated schools in Israel. And one of them is that peace community. But one of the problems they face is the young Jews in the community have to do military service. The Palestinians don't, even though they're Israeli citizens. And then what happens when one of those soldiers is killed? And they want to honor that soldier. And the Palestinians say he was serving in an army to kill our relatives. And they have to have those conversations, and they do. And they model how to do those very, very difficult conversations. So there are those glimmers of hope, and we visit a lot of them on these trips. I know we got a few more minutes for other questions, comments, additions, corrections. Anything in the chat that I need to address?
Yes, Cliff asks, what's the future of gay rights in Israel, especially with the new government?
That's a great question. The Tel Aviv is a mecca for gay and lesbian LGBTQ folk, and there's a kind of an underground coffee shop restaurant life LGBTQ in Ramallah. Still very under the radar, but people know where it is, and it's one of the more progressive areas. One of the people to read is a Quaker graduate of the Ramallah Friends Schools, Saed Atshan, who now teaches at Swarthmore. He has written on this. He's a queer Palestinian Quaker, Saed Atshan, Atshan. He has written on this extensively, so he's a good source of information. Now, of course, this new right-wing government is, largely propped up by the far-right religious groups in the government, and they certainly are opposed to LGBTQ concerns. One of the people we will meet this summer, Steve will get a chance to meet her, is Debbie Hill, who's a convert to Judaism out of West Virginia in 1994, moved to Israel, and she's a photojournalist, amazing photo. You often see her images at AP, UPI, national publications, and she's a lesbian, lives in a loving relationship with Yael, her partner, and we will meet with Debbie in Jerusalem this summer, and you can ask that question directly. But it's not easy in Jerusalem. It's not easy in the religious settlements. It's easier in Tel Aviv. But what Saed and other queer activists talk about is pink washing, that Israel often lifts up this liberal attitude in Tel Aviv, pink washing, when it's really not the case in a place like Jerusalem or in the settlements. It's certainly dangerous for many in the Palestinian territories where conservative religion still reigns. Other questions? Stephanie and Sandy have their hands up. They could answer all these questions themselves. You're muted, Sandy.
Max, thanks very much. Friends, I'm from Central Philadelphia Monthly Meeting of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting.
We are.
And Stephanie as well. And we've known Max for a long time. And Stephanie traveled with Max on one of those trips a bunch of years ago. So thank you for tonight, Max, and thank you for your life and career devoted to Palestinian human rights. A lot of my work has been based in things going on here in the States, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about any of those efforts. I'll just say one example is Skip Shield is on this call, and he's very active with Quaker Palestine Israel Network. There's lots of others too. Yeah.
Well, let me give just one example of some of the ways we can help. We haven't had much luck working with our Congress, with our representatives, the various administrations. So a lot of it's grassroots work. And one of the programs and we'll visit this place this summer, is our support for the Tent of Nations. This is a Palestinian farm, 100-acre farm outside of Bethlehem. They hold title to their land, which is unusual for Palestinians. They got it from the Ottomans. 3 generations ago, they decided, even though they had to pay taxes, we are going to get title to our land. Well, they're in Area C, though. And they're surrounded by 4 settlements, one of which is at least 35,000 people. and they want this 100 acres. And because they're in Area C, Israel will not grant them building permits. They're just demolition orders on everything above ground. It's a farm. They're demolition orders on fences, barns, cisterns. The road in front of their house has been cut. When the wall is completed, they'll cut them off from their markets and Bethlehem. But they are persisting in staying on their land, planting trees, planting vines, even though the vines are burned, the trees are cut. One time I was over there with a group of Guilford students just after the Army had bulldozed about 1,500 of their apricot trees 2 weeks before harvest and buried them. But they persist. And we go over during the olive harvest. I went over this October the first time and lived there for a week. And our presence with other international volunteers has kept them safe during harvest season. Now, olive harvest season is when settlers sweep in and cut trees and steal the harvest and burn the fields. But because all these international volunteers come for the harvest season, since 2002, when this program started, they have not been molested during the harvest season. So that's one way people can help. There's also financial support at places like the Tent of Nations. You can look it up, tentofnations.org, one word, the Nasser family. But also to go over and volunteer with these organizations. And there's, the Christian peacemaker teams, there's EPI, there are, so many of these different groups that people can volunteer and be on the ground actually helping protect these people.
Max, do you know what happened with the hearing that they had on the 12th of February?
It was delayed again. They keep kicking the can down the road. They're trying to get their title to the land re-registered in Israel. Now, Israel's admitted, yeah, you own the land, you've got title, we can't deny that, but we don't have to register it officially because, they want the land. And so they're doing everything they can to force them out. And they go to court, they have lawyers, financial support helps pay the $250,000 they've spent over the last 20 years just proving in the courts that they own their own land. Yeah. And the court simply kicks down the road. They say, well, we don't have enough information. We can't re-register you yet. And just keeps them on edge. So it's just a delaying tactic, hoping that they'll outlast them. And here's Jane has just given me this. Dear friends, I want to update you briefly on the re-registration hearing that was held the 12th of February. Yeah. Representative of the State of Israel, the absentee property custodian, did not show up. The only remaining objector is a Palestinian family who claim ownership of part of the farm. Their lawyer was present. They have to provide documents substantiating their claims to the committee and our lawyer within the next few days in preparation for what we hope might be the final hearing on March the 2nd. So again,
that's Thursday.
That's coming up on Thursday. And we've been trying to get our congressperson who's Jewish and has all kinds of contacts in Israel to speak up for this family. We've had a Zoom interview with her, but today we've not had much luck. So it's one of the things, if you have contact with representatives who might be willing to speak up, this would be helpful. I know we're at the end of the time. Any other questions that I haven't addressed or other questions I've raised?
Max, if someone were interested in traveling with you in June, how would they get in touch with
you? You got my email, mcarter@guilford.edu, MCARTER @Guilford, no D, Guilford, D on the end, not Guildford, but Guilford.edu. And we'll send out an application. Again, it's June 6 to 24. I will do some voluntary service at the Friends Schools, painting, cleaning, landscaping, meet with local families, often hosted in local families with Guilford connections for meals. A focus will be on the impact of the military occupation on the indigenous Palestinian Christian community, which has been decimated by migration and the situation. The Ramallah Friends meeting is essentially gone. The building is there, but the membership is in the United States. And that's true of many of the Christian populations. And then we'll travel to places I've mentioned, Hebron, Bethlehem, the Jordan Valley, up to the Galilee, up to the kibbutz, Nevi Shalom, Wad al-Salam, travel with the breaking the silence. You'll come back exhausted, but your eyes will be open.
Skip,
Yeah.
There seems to be a new wave of armed resistance. Think of Jenin and Nablus recently with the violence there. And
Yeah.
it's not coordinated as far as I know, but I wonder what your views are, especially in the Quaker context of supporting or working with or advocating for that form of resistance. And if there's no advocacy for that, then what do we suggest for a solution?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tough one. I know Quakers had to face that one in South Africa in the 70s, 80s, into the 90s. What the people we work with say is you're going to get armed resistance as long as there's an occupation, as long as Israel and the United States supports Israel in this brutal occupation. You're going to get that kind of violence. So one of the things, let's address the occupation, figure out a way to end that. But the Palestinians we work with say we have a right to resist. That's a human right guaranteed in Geneva Conventions, that those people who are occupied have the right to armed resistance. It's our right, but it's not effective. And after 2005, Palestinian civil society rejected armed resistance and violence, about 150 organizations in civil society, and came up with alternatives, appealing to international law, nonviolent demonstrations, boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS, educational reform, critical thing. They had about a 10-step program. So I think what Quakers, with our testimony, are best equipped to do is to support those nonviolent initiatives and support the nonviolent movement in Palestine, which is a majority movement. You're going to have militants. You got some armed militants in the United States, for heaven's sake, and figure out how to strengthen and support the nonviolent movements here. Yeah, Cliff has a hand up.
and that'll be our last question.
Yeah, okay. You're muted, Cliff.
There you go.
There you go.
Max, help you get people to go on tour this summer. The Quakers Advocating Justice for Palestine has the Isaac Rawischer Memorial Fund. And so there are some scholarships, especially to people in the New England Yearly Meeting. And that can be up to, I believe it was $1,000 to help them with expenses. And Skip Shield can also help people get the forms out to be able to fill to get this financial help.
Thanks, Cliff. And then thanks for your advocacy and your coming over to Palestine and helping in so many ways. You were there how many weeks this year? Last year?
2 months.
2 months, yeah.
And The good thing is I submitted a proposal for the Faith and Practice retreat that's going to happen April 1st up in Maine. And it's about leadings, and my proposal was accepted. So I'll be doing one of the workshops that afternoon. I'm so
great.
excited about that.
Good.
We're going to talk
And-
about.
Great. And if people, can't take 3 weeks off, or, the trip in June just doesn't work for any variety of reasons, we're also hoping to go back for the olive harvest in October. And that's a shorter trip and very hands-on. You live at the farm for about 5 days and you pick olives. And it's
I
both
did it
fun.
I did it last fall, and I highly recommend it also.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, thank you all. I imagine I raised more questions than I answered. But please, if you have my email, and please feel free to share my email with folk. Be in touch with other questions, comments. And if you're interested in the trip, be happy to fire off an application to you.
Thank you, Max. And thank you, everyone, for being with us this evening. I know we went over time, but it seems well worth it. And we deeply appreciate your being here. So this program has been recorded and will be available eventually at the yearly meeting website. And we'll get that word out to you as soon as we know that it's loaded on the website. So thank you. And Max, thank you for everything. And
thank you all for the opportunity, and hope to see you again sometime.